Hey there guys, it's Amit, you're watching DevDreamer, and this is the complete guide to CSS Grid. In this one video, we're going to learn the entire CSS Grid layout system using examples throughout. First, we'll look at the grid container properties and then all the grid item properties, and make sure you watch right to the very end because we'll be taking what we've learned and building a dashboard design using CSS Grid. And of course, there are chapters or timestamps in the description box below to each individual section. If you're new here and you enjoy the content, consider hitting that like and subscribe button down below. Make sure to turn on all notifications by clicking the bell so you're notified as soon as new content is up. Okay, so let's start with answering the question, what is CSS Grid? CSS Grid is the most powerful layout system in CSS. It's known as a two-dimensional system, meaning it can be used to lay out elements in rows and columns at the same time. Now, in our previous lesson, we looked at the complete guide to CSS Flexbox, and sometimes people are a bit confused as to the difference between CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox, so let's see what the main difference is between the two. The main difference between the two is that Grid is a two-dimensional system and Flexbox is a one-dimensional system. And all that basically means is, with Grid, we have control over how we lay out our elements horizontally and vertically, okay, or across the rows and the columns at the same time. Whereas with Flexbox, you're laying out your elements either in a column, like we have here, or in a row. You have to pick one or the other. We can't do both within a single Flexbox container. So that's the main difference between the two. And actually, Grid and Flexbox work really well together. Okay, so before we look at some code and see how CSS Grid works, it would be really helpful to understand the main concepts behind Grid. And this will give you a clearer picture of how it works. Okay, so first then we have grid lines. In CSS Grid, our columns and rows are made up using grid lines. So we can have either column lines or row lines. Here we have an example of a column line, and this would actually be column line number 3 as it's the third line from the left. Next we have grid tracks, and these are basically the full column or row in a grid container. So here we have the grid track between the second and third row lines. There's also grid areas. Think of these as the total space surrounded by 4 grid lines like we have here. And then finally we've got a grid cell, which is basically a single space within our grid. If you've ever used Microsoft Excel, then you can think of grid cells as the different cells in an Excel spreadsheet. Don't worry too much at this stage guys if you're not sure what this means, we will go over all this as we go through the code. Now CSS Grid is made up of container properties and item properties, and you can see them all here. Now don't worry, I won't bore you by reading them all out because as you can see there are quite a lot of them here, but you can feel free to pause the video to have a read. Okay, so that's enough of the visuals. Let's now jump into the code and we'll start by going through each container property in detail. Okay, so here we are then in our text editor. In our HTML we have this div with an ID of container, and then inside that we have 6 divs each with a class of item and a class of 1 to 6 as well, and that's these yellow items over here. Let's take a look at our CSS. Okay, so this is just a styling for our container. Now, in order to turn this container into a grid container, we simply set the display on the container to grid. And now you can see all of our items have actually expanded to fill this container. All these items are now grid items. Now notice that all of our items are stacked one on top of each other, all in a single column. Well, with CSS Grid, we can actually specify the number of columns and rows we want our grid to have by using the following 2 properties. And these are going to be the first 2 properties we look at. They are grid template columns and grid template rows. Now the way that this works is, not only do we specify the number of columns and the number of rows that we want, but we also specify the size of said columns and rows. Let's see how this works. So first of all then, on grid template columns, let's say we want our items to be in a column of 200 pixels. And now you can see all of our items are stacked inside a column that is 200 pixels in width. And let's keep going. Let's say we wanted another column of 200 pixels. And another one. So now you see we've specified 1, 2, 3 values. Let's just minimize this bit. 1, 2, 3 values, and we have 1, 2, 3 columns that each are 200 pixels in width. Now notice we've got some extra spacing here, and whenever we want our items to fill up any extra space that we've got, we can simply say auto. And now items fill up this extra space. So whenever there's an undefined size of space that we want to fill up, we can just use the auto keyword. Now we're not just limited to pixels, so let's just scrap this. We can also use percentages, so let's go for a first column of 50%. Okay, so we've got a 50% column here, and another one of 25%, and a final one of 25%. Now CSS Grid also comes packed with some special functions and keywords. Let's take a look at what they are and how they work. So first we're going to look at the fractional unit. Now whilst we can use these units, percentages and pixels etc, when we want equal columns or rows, the preferred unit to use on our grid container is a new unit, which is the fractional unit. The fractional unit takes a fraction of the available space and divides it equally. So let's say we wanted 3 equal width columns. Well, we just say 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. and now you see we have 3 equal width columns of 1FR, and if we actually expand the viewport, we can see that these will always adhere to that rule. Now when we're using the same value as we are here, we can use the repeat function. So let's just scrap this and say repeat, and then in brackets here we specify 2 values. The first is how many times we want this to repeat, so we're going to say 3, and then comma what we want the size to be, so we're going to say 1FR, and here you see we get exactly the same thing. We have 3 equal width columns that are a fraction each. So if we wanted 6 equal width columns, we just change this to 6, and now you can see we have 6 equal width columns. Now another special function we have access to is the min-max function. Now this is really helpful. As you can probably guess by the name, min-max enables us to specify a minimum value and a maximum value that we want our column to have. So let's get rid of this, and let's say we want our first column to have a fractional unit like we've seen before, but for the second column we're going to say min-max, and then in brackets this takes 2 values. The first value is the minimum width that we want our column to have, so I'm going to say 300 pixels. Then we do comma, space, and now the second value is going to be the max value that we want our column to have. So let's go for 1FR. So at the moment then they both look the same, but let's go ahead and shrink our viewport width down, and let's see what happens. So they're both shrinking at the sort of same rate, but at this point here you can see that it's only the first column that shrinks, and that's because our second column here has hit the min width of 300 pixels. Min comes first, then max. We can probably see this better with 400 pixels actually, so let's just change this to 400, and again they both shrink at the same rate, but at that point there the second column hits that 400 pixel minimum width, so it's not going to go any smaller than 400 pixels, but our first column here of 1FR continues to shrink. Okay, so that's the min-max function. Let's go ahead and set this back to, let's go for repeat, and let's go for 3 300 pixel columns. Okay, so we have our 3 columns of 300 pixels each, but we've also got this extra space here. Let's say we wanted to fill the space in with 300 pixel columns as long as we had the space and as long as we had the items to fill them in. We can do that by using another special value that we have in CSS Grid, which is the autofill value. So let's say auto-fill. So instead of specifying a number now, we're saying autofill. So let's expand our container to see what happens. And as you can see, whenever there is a 300 pixel space there, because that's what we've specified in our repeat function here, and as long as we've got items to fill them in, our items will jump up and fill in those columns. So there and there as well. So that's autofill. Now there's also autofit, and the difference between the two can be a bit confusing, but let me explain. So first of all, let's go to our HTML, and let's just get rid of these items for now. So we've just got 2. And to really see the magic of autofit, it's best to use a min-max value. So let's just get rid of this. Instead of 300 pixels, let's say min-max, minimum of 300 pixels, and a max of 1FR. And let's just go ahead and minimize our container so that our items fit perfectly within the container, like so. Okay, so we've set our columns to repeat with autofill on and a min-max of 300 pixels and 1 fraction. So let's see what happens as we start expanding this container. Okay, at this point, we've now got a 300 pixel space inside a container, and so autofill fills our container with an extra column. If we keep growing, we can see now we've got 2 columns that are 300 pixels in width. If we just right click and open up the DevTools, we can see this more clearly, and now you can see those 2 columns. So autofill will fill our container with columns with the width that we've specified, as long as it's got the spacing there. So let's set this back and see what autofit does. Let's just turn off DevTools, and let's change this to autofit. Now let's see what happens. So let's expand our container. Keep expanding, keep going, and as you can see, no additional columns are created even though we're expanding our container. Now what's happening here? Well, the difference then between autofill and autofit is that autofill creates the columns even if there are no items to fill them in. So we've only got in our HTML here, we've got 2 items. But autofill will continue to create the columns even if there are no additional items there that can fill them in. Autofit only creates the columns if we do have items to fill them in. So let's go ahead and just minimize this again, and let's go ahead and add some more items in. Okay, so now we've got 6, and now we've still got autofit on, so let's just expand our container again and see what happens. So this time, because we do have extra items that can fit into that space, autofit goes ahead and creates the columns. Okay, so that's the difference between autofill and autofit. Let's just go ahead and reset our grid template columns to repeat, and we'll go for 3 1FR. Okay, Now we can also choose to name the grid lines. So our column grid lines are 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can choose to name these lines like so. To name a line, you simply put it in square brackets. So I'm going to call this first column line col, which is short for column, start. Okay, and that column is going to have a width of 1 fr. The second column line I'm going to call col-2, and again, that column will be 1 fr. So far then what we've got is this line here is col start, then we've got a 1 fr column width. This line here is called col-2, and then we have a column width of 1 fr. Let's keep going. The third line is going to be called col-3, 1 fr. So we've got col start, col-2, col-3, and then this final column line here I'm going to call column-end. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we're not just doing it for fun. Naming our grid lines, whether it's our column lines or our row lines, will become useful when it comes to moving our items around within our grid container. And that's done using a grid item property. And of course, we'll use these and take a look at that property a bit later on. And of course, we can do the same thing for rows as well. So let's go ahead and specify our first row to be 100 pixels in height. And our second row, let's go for something smaller. Let's go for 50 pixels. So that's how to set up our columns and rows on our grid. Now notice, on the rows here, we've got all this extra space. And the reason why we've got this space is because we only have 6 items. If we had more, then they would continue to wrap down and fill up our container. Let's go ahead and add a few more items. Okay, so now we have 12 items and we filled up our container. And that brings me on nicely to my next point. We've only defined 2 rows here. So we've explicitly defined a 100 pixel row and a 50 pixel row. And so any subsequent rows will be implicitly defined. These are known as implicit grid tracks. Well, let's say we wanted to control the size of our implicit grid tracks. We can do this by using the next properties we're going to learn, which are grid auto columns and grid auto rows. Okay, so let's say we want any additional rows in our container to also have a 50 pixel height. We do that by simply setting grid auto rows to 50 pixels. And now you can see our additional rows here have a height of 50 pixels. So in this way we can control the size of any implicitly defined grid tracks, and of course you can do the same thing for grid auto columns as well. Now we also have grid auto flow, and this works in a similar way to grid auto columns and rows, in that it's all about how things are automatically placed inside our grid container. So for this then, let's go ahead and change grid template columns to repeat 12 1 fr. So now we have 12 equally width columns. And let's remove these extra items so we've just got 6. Okay, so by default, grid auto flow is set to row. And what this basically means is, whenever we have any new items inside a container, place these items inside a container according to the row. So let's put some new items into our container and let's see how this works. Okay, so now we have 2 new items, items A and B. And as you can see, they've both been placed along the row. Let's go ahead and add some more items in here. And as you can see, they're all being placed alongside the row. And again, that's because grid auto flow is set to row. We can also set grid auto flow to column. So let's go back to our CSS and let's change this to column. And now you can see our items are laid out according to the column. So that if we were to add some more items in here, you can see that the items are being placed inside a container according to the column. Now there is also another value for grid auto flow here, and that is the value of dense. So let's just go ahead and remove column. And for this, I'm just going to go ahead and select item A. And what I'm doing here is I'm using a item property called grid column to move item A inside a container. And of course, we will look at this a bit later on. I'm just going to set this to 10/11. Essentially, all that means is take item A and start it at column 10 and end on column 11. So that's column line 10 and column line 11. So now items A and B have been pushed over here. So now let's set grid auto flow to dense and let's see what happens. Okay. Item B has now moved to fill in this extra space that we had, even though in our source order, item B is placed after item A. Let's go ahead and duplicate item B again, and let's see what happens. As you can see, these items have filled in this extra space that we had. And again, that's because we've got grid auto flow set to dense. Now use dense with caution because obviously it will change the visual order of your items. We can also say row-dense and column-dense to give us a bit more control as to how these items are filled in. So just bear that in mind. For now, let's go ahead and set grid auto flow to the default of row. Let's remove this and let's get rid of these extra items as well. Okay, let's also just change this to 3 as well. Okay, so now the next grid container property we're going to look at is how to set gaps in between our items. So at the moment then you can see our items are all bunched up close together. There's no gaps in between them. And we do that using grid column gap and grid row gap. So let's say we wanted a 10 pixel gap in between our columns. Well, we simply set grid column gap to 10 pixels. And now we've got our 10 pixel spacing. Let's do the same for grid row gap as well. And now we also have 10 pixel gap along the row as well. Now there is a shorthand property of this as well, so we can just say grid hyphen gap, and for this first we specify the row and then we specify the column. So let's say we wanted a 20 pixel gap on the row, and let's go for a 30 pixel gap for the column. So as you can see, it can be declared on a single line. Now here we've got our column gap and our row gap set to the same amount, so we can just specify one value in here, and what this will do is it will set the same value for both rows and columns. So now we have a 10 pixel column gap and a 10 pixel row gap. Now the next grid container properties we're going to look at are all to do with how we position our items within their cells. So we have align items, justify items and place items. Let's start with align items. So align items positions our items vertically within the grid cell. So by default this is set to stretch, but we can change this to start, and now you can see our items are placed within their actual cells at the start. And to see this better, let's just right click and open up DevTools. Okay, so now you can see each item within its actual cell, and let's change this to end. We can also say center. So align items is all about how we position our items vertically within their actual cells. Now justify items does the same thing, but instead this is along the x-axis or horizontally. So here we can say start. As you can see now it's been placed at the start of the cell, and again we can say end, center, and again by default this is actually set to stretch. And finally, place items is just a shorthand for align items and justify items. So the way this works is first we say how we want to align our items, so as is center, and then we say how we want to justify our items, so as is stretch. So we get the exact same thing here, simply by using the shorthand property of place items. If we wanted them both to have the same value, for example if we wanted justify items to be center as well, then we can just specify a single value in place items of center. And this aligns our items to the center and justifies items to the center as well. Okay, for now let's just set this to the default of stretch, and let's go ahead and comment these out. So that's how to place our items within their actual cells. To place our entire content within the container, we use align content, justify content and place content. So let's see how these work. Okay, so let's just move this up, and let's start with align content. So again, align content is all about how we align our content vertically within our container. So it's currently set to start, because at the start of our container here, we can say end, and that puts that at the end, and we can also say center. We can do space between, so now we've got space in between our items, space around, so now we have space not only in between our items, but also around our items, and finally we can say space evenly, so that we have an equal amount of spacing either side. Let's go ahead and set this to center for now. And now for justify content, we can do the same thing except horizontally. So let's just first go ahead and change our fractional unit to 150 pixels. Okay, so we've got some space to work with here. And so at the moment, this is in the start position. Again, we can also say end to move it to the end horizontally. Center, space between, space around, and finally space evenly. Place content, as you probably guessed, is a shorthand property for align content and justify content. So if we were to write this as a shorthand property, we'd simply say center, space, evenly. And as you can see, we get the exact same thing here. So once again, if we wanted to, we could just go ahead and comment these out. Again, if we're using the same value, then we just specify a single value. So this sets align content to center and justify content to center. The next property we're going to look at is grid template areas. This one's pretty cool. Grid template areas is basically a visual representation of our container, and it works hand in hand with the grid item property called grid area. So let's see how this works. For this example, I'm just going to go ahead and change our CSS and HTML. Okay, so we've just commented everything out except for display grid. Let's also change our HTML. Okay, so now instead of numbers, we've got 4 divs called header, main, sidebar and footer, and they've all got a different color. Okay, so let's see how grid template areas works. I'm just going to set grid template columns and grid template rows to the following. Okay, so for grid template columns then, we've got 3 equal width columns as we're using one fraction, and we've also named our column lines as well. And then for the rows, our first row is 60 pixels, our third row is 100 pixels, and then in between the two we have auto, so that any items here will just fill up the space. Okay, let's give ourselves some space here, and let's say grid template areas. So the way that this works is, we're basically defining areas within our container, and we do this with double quotes. Now each double quote represents a single row, so we have 1, 2, 3 rows, so we're going to need 3 double quotes. So this is the 60 pixel row, this is the auto row, and this is the third row of 100 pixels. Now the way that this works is, within each row, depending on how many columns you've specified, so here we've specified 1, 2, and 3, you're basically naming each column within the row. So what we want for this top row of 60 pixels is a header. So I'm going to say header, header, and header 3 times like this. Now the reason why we specify header 3 times is because these are a visual representation of each column. This is the first column, the second column, and the third column, because we want header to span the full width of our container. For the second row, I'm going to say main, main, and then sidebar. And then finally, for the last row of 100 pixels, we want this to be the footer. Okay, so as you can see, there's not much change that's taken place at the moment. And that's because, as mentioned, the grid template areas property works hand in hand with the grid item property called grid area. So how this works is, each element here needs to be selected. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so we've selected each element, and now we simply put in their grid area values. So header is going to be header. And as you can see now, our header element takes up the full width of our container, because in our grid template areas property, we specified this first top row to take up the full width of this container with the header value. Let's do the same for the rest. So main, sidebar, and finally footer. And check this out, guys. How cool is this? Our layout now reflects exactly what we had in our grid template areas. So you can kind of look at this as a blueprint, I guess, for your content. We've got the header going across the top, and then for the second row, our main div spans 2 columns. And then for the final column in this second row, we have sidebar. And then finally, we have footer going across the bottom for the last row. Now you don't need to call them header, main, sidebar, and footer. We can actually call this whatever we want. So let's actually just use the first letters of each and change grid area to H. And now we still have that exact same effect. So that's the grid template areas property. Okay, so we've got 2 more grid container properties to look at, and then we move on to the grid item properties. So the first one we're going to look at is grid template. Now grid template is a shorthand property for setting grid template rows, grid template columns, and grid template areas in a single declaration. Okay, so let's go ahead and comment all these out, and let's rewrite this using the shorthand property. So we say grid hyphen template, and the way this works is, first we specify our grid template areas. So again, this is just going to be this one here. So we have the letter H 3 times. And then after that, on the same line, we can specify what we want this row to be. So we want this row to be 60 pixels. Okay, let's keep going with the next row. Okay, so we've said main, main, sidebar, and we want this row to be auto. And for the final row, we have our footer of 100 pixels. So we've specified the grid template areas and the grid template rows. To specify our grid template columns, we simply say, and I'm going to put this on a new line, we say slash, and now here we just add our value for the grid template columns. Okay, so in our case, it's going to be this. So as you can see, using the grid template shorthand property, we can specify all of this in a single declaration. And now the final grid container property that we're going to learn is simply called grid. Now as mentioned, just like grid template, grid is also a shorthand property. To show you how this works, let's go ahead and reset our code. Okay, so we're back to our usual numbers now, numbers 1 to 6. And we've set grid template rows to 50 pixels, 200 pixels. So we have a 50 pixel row and a 200 pixel row. Grid template columns is repeat 3 1FR, so we have 3 equal width columns. We've set grid auto rows to 100 pixels, and remember this basically sets the size for any additional rows that we have. And finally we've set grid auto flow to row, which is the default value for grid auto flow. So once again, grid is a shorthand property for setting either grid template rows and grid template columns, which are known as our explicit values, or grid auto rows, grid auto columns, and grid auto flow, which are known as our implicit values. So let's see how this works. The first thing to note is that we can only specify one or the other. In this shorthand, we can only declare either our explicit values or our implicit values. So let's start with grid template rows and columns. So the way that this works is, first we specify what we want the rows to be, slash, and then the columns. So here we can say 50 pixels, 200 pixels to match this, and then we can say repeat 3 1FR, and we get the same thing. Just to show you we can change this, let's change this to 100, and now we have a 50 pixel row and a 100 pixel row. So we can use grid to set our explicit values in a shorthand like so. Now let's look at how to set implicit values. So with implicit values then, this is still the row side and this is still the column side. So we've specified grid auto rows to be 100 pixels and grid auto flow to be row. So on the row side, we're going to say auto-flow, and this is basically saying set grid auto flow to row because we've specified it on the row side. And next we just add our implicit row value, which is 100 pixels. So we do space 100 pixels. And for our columns, again, we're just using this. So to summarize then, the grid shorthand property can be used to set our explicit values, grid template rows and grid template columns, or our implicit values, grid auto rows, grid auto columns, and grid auto flow. And the thing to remember is we cannot set both explicit and implicit values on the same side. So this is absolutely fine because we've set our rows to be implicit. What we can't do is set our rows to be implicit and then also on this side specify our explicit rows. Okay, so that's all the grid container properties. Well done on coming this far. We've gone through each and every single one, and now what we're going to do is we're going to do the same for the grid item properties. Okay, so now let's take a look at the grid item properties. So we've got pretty much the same setup as we had before, where we had our 6 items. On the container, we've set grid template columns to have 3 equally width columns of 1FR, and I've also chosen to name the column lines as well. And then on grid template rows, we've got repeat 3 100 pixels. Okay, let's now start with looking at the first grid item property. And we're actually going to look at 2 together here, and those are grid column start and grid column end. And what these enable us to do is position our items within the container according to the grid column lines. So let's go ahead and select item number 1. So if we take a look at our container then, currently item number 1 has grid column start of 1 and a grid column end of 2. So currently then it's set to 1 and 2, no change there. But let's say we wanted item number 1 to span right the way across to line number 3 of our column. So we can set grid column end to 3. And as you can see, item number 1 starts on line number 1 and ends on line number 3. We can also say it to, of course, 4. So it spans the total width of our container. Another way to target the very last line is to simply say -1. And as you can see, item number 1 spans the full width of the container. Now instead of using these numbers here, we can also use the names that we've specified on grid template columns over here. So let's take col start, which was the first line here, put this in here, and let's go something different, let's go col 3, which was the third column line, and paste this in grid column end. And now you can see item number 1 starts on line 1 and ends on line 3. Now we can also use the span keyword, so let's just get rid of this and let's say span 3. And so what we're saying here is start item number 1 on our first line called col start and then span 3 lines across, so 1, 2 and 3. If we said span 2, then it would span to our third line here, so it starts here 1 and 2. And again, instead of the numbers, we can also specify a name, so let's say col-end or col 2. Now we can also do the same for the rows, so let's go ahead and target item number 2 now, and this works in exactly the same way. So remember now our grid row lines are going across, so this is line 1, this is line 2, line 3, line 4 for our third row, and then line 5 is the last row line down here. So let's say we wanted item number 2 to actually start on row line number 2, so we can say grid row start 2, and now you can see item number 2 has moved to start on row line 2. And let's say we wanted item number 2 to go right the way down to the bottom of our container. Well, remember this was line number 5, so we can just say 5. And now you can see item number 2 spans right the way down to the end of the container. Now we also have a couple of short-term properties for setting both of these. So instead of saying grid column start and grid column end, we can just say grid column. And down here we can say grid row. And the way that these work is we say start, end. So for grid column start, we want col start, so we just put that in there. And for grid column end, we want to say span to col 2, so just put that in there. Let's do the same for grid row 2/5. So to summarize then, these properties enable us to move our items around a container and also to span items across multiple lines. Now the next set of item properties we're going to learn are align self, justify self, and place self. So let's see how these work. So let's go ahead and target item number 5. Okay, so we've got align self, justify self, and place self. So these properties, as you can probably guess from their names, enable us to position a single item, which is why we use the word self, anywhere within its own cell. So you should be familiar then with how these work. So with align self, we're going to position our item vertically, so let's go for start, So now you can see it's positioned at the start of its cell, and we have the usual ones. We've got end, we can say center, and of course by default this is set to stretch. For justify self we can do the same thing, so we can say start, end, center, and again by default it's set to stretch. And then place self is just a shorthand property for both of these. So let's set these both to, in fact let's set this one to center and let's set this one to, let's go for start. So we can declare this on a single line using place self by just saying center, start. So now if we comment this out, you see we've still got exactly the same thing. Now if we had the same value for both, so let's just uncomment these and just set them both to center. If we had the same value for both, we can just use the one value in here, like so. Okay, so that's how to use the align self, justify self, and place self properties. And that leads us on to the final item property, which is grid area. Now the grid area property can be used in one of two ways. The first is as an even shorter shorthand property for setting grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, and grid row end. Now the syntax for this can be slightly confusing, so let's just break this down. Let's just go ahead and comment these out for item number 2, and instead let's use grid area. So the way that this works is we're going to specify 4 values, each separated with a slash. The first is what we want our grid row start to be. So remember, we want item number 2 to start where item number 4 is currently, and we want it to span all the way down to the end of our container. So our grid row start for number 2 is going to be 2. And now you can see it's moved into this position here. Then we say slash, and next we specify the grid column start. Well, we want it to start on the first column line, so here we're going to say 1. Okay, next we specify the grid row end, so we want this to be 5. And finally the grid column end is going to be this column line here, which is going to be number 2. So with grid area, we've actually specified the items row start and column start, as well as the row end and column end. And now the second way that grid area can be used is something that we've looked at already. Remember guys, grid area works hand in hand with the grid container property called grid template areas. So we have looked at this one already, but just for completeness, let's just go ahead and show it to you again. So first thing, let's go to our HTML and change these item names. Okay, so now we have our 4 divs, header, main, sidebar, and footer. Let's go back to our CSS. Let's just go ahead and remove these styles. And on our container here, we need to set our grid template areas. So let's go up to container. Okay, so this is our grid template areas. So we want our header to span the full width of the top, the footer to span the full width at the bottom, and in the middle, we want our main item to span 2 columns across, and then we have the sidebar. Okay, so now we can use grid area to position our items. So let's go ahead and select each of our items. Okay, and now one more thing to do before we set our grid areas is to just set our grid template rows. So we want our header to have a height of 60 pixels, we want auto for the middle, and then a 100 pixel footer. So now we can just say for header, it's going to be H, main is M, sidebar is S, and footer is F. And as you can see, once again, we get this layout. And with that guys, we've gone through every single grid property. So we looked at all the container properties and all the item properties. Finally, let's now use what we've learned and put it into practice. Okay, so for this example then, we're going to be recreating this dashboard design here. This is actually a dribble shot from OutCrowd, and I'll leave a link to this in the description box below. But essentially what we're looking to do then is to take this design and lay it out using CSS Grid. Now I've actually opened this image up in a new tab, so let's just close this for now. Okay, so here it is in a new tab. And for this, I've already gone ahead and created all these little elements here. So if you take a look at our page, so I've gone ahead and created all those elements. And now what we want to do is use CSS Grid to lay this out so that we turn this into this. Okay, so first of all then, let's take a look at our HTML. We have a div with an ID of container, and then inside that we have a div with an ID of nav, main, and profile. And those 3 elements there basically relate to the following. So if you have a look at this design, we can see that it actually consists of 3 columns. One here, another one here, this progress dashboard section, and then another one over here. And I've called those nav, main, and profile. So the very first thing we want to do then is we want to set our container, this div with an ID of container, to display of grid. Okay, so on container here, let's just change this to R1. Okay, so on container, I'm going to say display grid. And now what we want to do is we want to define our columns. So our nav column is the smallest, our main section is the largest column, and then this one here, the profile section, is kind of in between the two. So I'm going to go ahead and set grid template columns to 1FR for the nav, 6FR for the main column, and then 3FR for the profile. So let's take a look at ours. Okay, so it's starting to take shape then. So now we've got 3 columns for nav, main, and profile. Now what I want to do is work on each of these individually. So let's first work on the nav section. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this window over, right the way over, and we can increase this up to there, and let's actually bump this up as well. Okay, so first I just want to define the grid template areas on our container. So I'm going to say grid template areas, and remember this was basically a visual representation of our layout. So we haven't specified any rows here, so all we need is a single line, and I'm going to say N for the first column for nav, M for main, and then P for profile. Now let's go to each element and fill these in. So on nav I'm going to say grid area N. Let's just copy this and do the same for the main area, or the main section rather, and call this M. And finally for profile we'll say grid area P. Okay, so now then let's work on this nav section here. So the first thing I want to do then is I want to set this to a display of grid. Now notice, although this is a grid item within our actual container, you can also nest grids so that this grid item is also a grid container for its items. And we'll be doing the same for the main section and the profile section as well. So let's see what we want this to look like then. Okay, so we've got our logo, and then we've got our 4 buttons here. We've got some spacing at the end, and if we think of this in terms of rows, the logo looks to be spanning over a few rows there, whereas our buttons look like they're all in single rows. So the way I've worked this out then is I've said if each of these buttons represents a single row, I'm looking at the height of that row, and I'm saying how many rows do we need for our entire nav section. And so visually we can say that we need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then here we can probably fit 2 more buttons here, 7 and 8. So on nav I'm going to say, and let's just switch back to design. Okay, I'm going to say grid template rows, and we're going to use the repeat function. So repeat, and we want 8 rows of equal height. Okay, so now our nav container has 8 equal rows. Let's now place our items into the center of their rows. So we want to center them horizontally as well as vertically. So we can use the shorthand property place items, and we're going to say center. And now you can see each of our elements or grid items have been centered within their cells. Now I do also want to specify how these grid items span over the rows. So again, if you take a look at our design, this logo here seems to be using up more than a single row. So what I'm going to say is select logo, and we're going to say grid hyphen row. Remember, grid row is the shorthand property for grid row start and grid row end. So here we specify 2 values where we want it to start. So we want this to start on row line 1, and we want it to end on row line 3. And now you can see we've got that spacing in between. Let's also go ahead and set the grid row for the other items. So I've given these buttons here a different class name. So class names are filter, dashboard, profile, and stats. So let's just copy this here and just put them all in for now, and we can go through and change them. So we want this to start on 3 and end on row line 4. I want this to be 4/5, this to be 5 and 6, and finally we want our last button here to start on row line 6 and end on row line 7. Okay, so that's our navbar section complete. Let's now move on to our main section. So for this, let's just minimize our text editor, and now we're working with the main section, so that's this right here. Okay, so if we take a look at the design then, we can see that this middle section here consists of 4 rows. We have 1 here, 2, 3 and 4, and we can also see that rows 1, 2 and 4 have roughly the same height. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set rows 1, 3 and 4 to have a height of 1FR, and then this third row here I'm going to give a height of auto. So on main then, the first thing I want to do is, let's just first switch back over to ours. Okay, first thing I want to do is set this to display of grid. I then want to set grid template rows, so grid template rows to 1FR, 1FR auto for the third row, and then 1FR for the final row. Okay, so this is what we've got. Now let's work on each row individually. So first then let's start with this top section here. So on the design, we can see that the title is actually closer to this second row here. So I'm going to use the place self shorthand property, which remember is a shorthand for align self and justify self, and I'm going to set this to end start. Okay, so what that's done is it set align self to end and then justify self to start. So it's set to end vertically and start horizontally, which is why it's pushed up into this bottom left hand corner here. Okay, great. Let's now work on our next section, and I've given this section a class of top, so section the class of top. And if you look at our design, we can see that this section consists of 1, 2, 3 columns, and this first column here seems to be about 3 times the size of these two. So First then, let's set our display on this to grid, and then let's set grid template columns to 3FR for this first section here, this exam unit 5, and then for these other two here, we're going to set those to 1FR and 1FR. Perfect. Now also on the design, you can see that there's actually some spacing here, so we're going to say grid column gap, and we're going to go for 25 pixels. Okay. And now the last thing we need to do for this row is, if you look carefully, the content is actually spanning the full height of the row. And if you look at the design, you can see that there's actually some spacing here. So we want to align this content to the start. So I'm going to say align content and set this to start. Okay, so that's this top section done. Now let's work on this middle section. So section with a class of middle. And if you look at the design, this actually consists of two equal width columns side by side. So we're going to say, once again, display of grid, and we're going to say grid template columns to 1FR and 1FR. And now you can see they're side by side. And finally, for this middle container, let's now work on this bottom section here, which also has two columns of equal width. So we've also given that a class of bottom. So here we're going to say display of grid. Let's just switch back over to our design, sorry. Okay, display of grid, and then we're going to say grid template columns, and let's use the repeat function this time. Say repeat, and we want to repeat twice, 1FR. Okay, so now they're side by side. There's also some spacing as well, so this spacing here looks to be the same as the spacing we've got on these columns here. So we used, what did we use? 25 pixels, so here I'm going to say grid column gap, and we're going to set this to 25 pixels as well. Okay, now you see we've got that 25 pixel gap. And finally, the content in this row is actually bunched up at the top of the cell. So we actually want to center this vertically. So we're going to say align content center. Perfect. So that is now our first two sections done. We've got our nav section and the main section. Let's now work on the final section, which is the profile. So let's see what we want this final section to look like. So once again here we can see that this final column here consists of 1, 2, 3 sections. And again, we can also put those into rows. So let's select our profile element right here, and let's give this a display of grid. And on this, I'm going to say grid template rows, and we're going to set this to the first row here to have height of 30%, the second to have a height of 15%, and then finally this course progress section to have height of 55%. Okay, and so if you take a look, we've got pretty much the same thing there. And with that, guys, we're done. Let's just make this full size. And this is the design we wanted with the layout. And this is what we've got. Once again, if you found this video useful, guys, please be sure to hit that like and subscribe button down below. And also, I'd love to hear from you guys, so do leave me a comment in the comment section down below. So take care, guys, get practicing, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.